The story begins with a young man, barely in his 20s, struggling through the hardships of life. Born into poverty, he had spent most of his years trying to survive rather than dream. His parents had passed away when he was young, leaving him to fend for himself. With no stable job, no proper education, and no one to turn to for help, he lived each day as it came, hoping that fate would eventually be kind to him. Despite his struggles, he had always held on to his dignity. He worked odd jobs, often laboring under the scorching sun for mere pennies. Some days, he went to bed hungry. Other days, he was forced to swallow his pride and beg for work. His life was a never-ending cycle of disappointment, and the weight of his misery grew heavier with each passing day. In contrast, the old woman was someone who had everything, at least on the surface. She was wealthy, powerful, and known in the town for her shrewd business mind. Despite her riches, she lived alone in a grand but empty mansion. Over the years, she'd seen many people come and go, but no one had ever truly stayed. People respected her, but no one loved her. She was a woman who had spent her life accumulating wealth, only to find that money could not fill the void of loneliness. Their paths crossed in the most unexpected way. One day, while the boy sat on the roadside, exhausted from another day of job hunting, he overheard a conversation between two men. They spoke in hushed tones about how the old woman was looking for a husband, an unusual request that caught the boy's attention. According to the men, she was willing to offer an enormous sum of money to the man who agreed to marry her. Some laughed at the absurdity of it, others shuddered at the thought. The boy, however, sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. Could this be his way out? Could this be the answer to the prayers he had whispered on cold, hungry nights? It was a deal that went against everything he believed in, yet he couldn't ignore the opportunity. He wasn't the only one struggling. He had younger siblings who needed support, debts he couldn't pay, and a future that seemed bleak. The thought of marrying a woman old enough to be his grandmother made his stomach turn, but the alternative, living in endless poverty, seemed even worse. As fate would have it, his hesitation was short-lived. That very evening, he found himself standing outside the gates of the old woman's mansion, his hands trembling. The grandeur of the place only emphasized how different their worlds were. When the gates opened, he stepped inside, knowing that his life was about to change forever. Whether it was for better or worse, he had no idea. But one thing was certain. This was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The boy had known nothing but hardship for as long as he could remember. Born into poverty, he had spent his childhood in a crumbling one-room house shared with his younger siblings. His parents had died when he was still a teenager, leaving him with the crushing responsibility of providing for his family. There was no time for dreams, no space for hope, only survival. Each day, he woke up before sunrise, setting out on foot to search for work. He knocked on doors, visited markets, and waited outside construction sites, hoping that someone would need an extra pair of hands. Sometimes, he was lucky enough to find a few hours of labor, carrying bricks, unloading goods, or cleaning the shops of wealthy merchants. But the pay was meager, barely enough to afford a meal. On days when no work was available, he returned home with empty pockets, his stomach growling in protest. Hunger was a constant companion. Many nights he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of how he would feed his siblings the next day. His younger brother and sister were still too small to understand the full weight of their situation, but they could feel it. They had learned not to ask for things other children had, toys, sweets, or even a warm meal. Instead, They accepted their reality with quiet resignation, their eyes filled with an innocence that the boy feared would soon fade. Despite his hardships, he dreamed. He dreamed of a better life, of escaping the chains of poverty that had held him captive since birth. He longed for stability, for a roof that didn't leak when it rained, for a day when he wouldn't have to worry about where the next meal would come from. He wanted to give his siblings a future where they wouldn't have to suffer as he did. But dreams, he had learned, were a luxury for the rich. For people like him, survival was the only goal. The world, however, was not kind to the poor. People looked down on him, treating him like he was invisible, or worse, like he was a stain on society. Shopkeepers shooed him away when he lingered too long, afraid he might steal. Wealthy families dismissed him with a wave of their hand, as if his presence alone was an inconvenience. Even those who pitied him did nothing to help. They simply sighed and muttered about how unfair life was before walking away, leaving him exactly where he was. There were moments when he felt the weight of despair crushing him, moments when he wondered if life was even worth living. He had no education, no skills beyond manual labor, and no connections to pull him out of his misery. It seemed as if he was trapped in an endless cycle: work, hunger, exhaustion, repeat. And no matter how hard he tried, he could never break free. As the days passed, his desperation grew. He could see no way out of his suffering, no path that led to a better future. That was until he overheard a conversation that changed everything. A wealthy old woman was looking for a husband, offering a life of luxury in exchange for marriage. The idea was absurd, even humiliating. But for the first time in his life, the boy saw a chance, an escape from the suffering that had defined his existence. It was a choice no young man should have to make. But for someone like him, it was the only choice he had. The boy never expected that his life would take such a drastic turn. He had spent his days drowning in poverty, believing that his fate was sealed. But fate, as it turned out, had a strange sense of humor. One evening, as he wandered the streets looking for work, he overheard a conversation between two merchants outside a tea stall. They were laughing, discussing a rumor that had been spreading through town. An old woman, a wealthy widow, was looking for a husband. The mere thought of it made people either chuckle or shudder in discomfort. She was old enough to be someone's grandmother, and yet she had made it known that she was seeking a young man to marry. The boy had no intention of paying attention to gossip, but something about the conversation stuck with him. Could it be true? And if it was, why would a woman of such wealth want a husband now? The thought was unsettling, yet a small voice in his mind whispered something he didn't want to admit. This could be his way out. The next day, curiosity got the better of him. He found himself standing outside the woman's mansion, its high iron gates making it clear that this was a world far beyond his reach. He had no plan, no idea what he would say if someone questioned him. But before he could turn away, the gates creaked open. A servant stood before him, his expression unreadable. "She has been expecting you," the man said simply. The boy's heart pounded. Expecting him? How? Had she somehow known he would come? Without another word, he was led inside. The house was vast, decorated with expensive furniture and golden chandeliers that cast eerie shadows in the dimly lit hallway. Everything smelled of wealth, yet there was an overwhelming emptiness in the air. Finally, he was brought to a room where she sat, her posture regal, her eyes sharp. She studied him, taking in his thin frame, his ragged clothes, his uncertainty. Then, in a calm but commanding voice, she spoke. "I want you to marry me." The boy's breath caught in his throat. He must have misheard her. "I will give you wealth, a home, and a future," she continued. In return, you will be my husband. Disbelief flooded his mind. This had to be a joke, a cruel trick. But the way she looked at him, calculating, expectant, told him she was entirely serious. He wanted to refuse. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was unnatural, that no young man should have to make such a choice. And yet, as the weight of his struggles crashed down on him, the temptation was undeniable. It wasn't just about him anymore. His siblings were starving. His future was bleak. He had no real options left. Still, the thought of saying yes sent a shiver down his spine. The days leading up to the wedding felt like a slow, agonizing march towards something inevitable. The boy had agreed, but not out of love or even duty. He had agreed because life had given him no choice. His hands had been tied by poverty, his dreams crushed by reality. This marriage was not a union of hearts, but a transaction, an escape from the suffering that had defined his existence. Yet, even knowing that, he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to him. His heart felt heavy, his mind clouded with doubts. Was he making a mistake? Would he regret this for the rest of his life? Every time he tried to push the thoughts away, the image of his hungry siblings flashed in his mind, and he reminded himself why he was doing this. When he told his family, their reactions were mixed. His younger siblings, too innocent to understand the gravity of his decision, simply asked if it meant they would have food every day. His relatives, distant aunts and uncles who had never lifted a finger to help, suddenly found their voices. Some scolded him for agreeing to something so unnatural. Others, more pragmatic, told him he was lucky to have found a way out. "At least you won't starve," one of them had said with a shrug. "Better to be the husband of an old woman than the slave of hunger." No one asked how he felt. No one wondered if he was happy. His life had never been his own to control, and this was just another chapter written by forces outside his grasp. The day of the wedding arrived faster than he expected, and with it came an overwhelming sense of finality. The ceremony was grand, as expected of a woman with immense wealth. The halls were decorated with golden drapes, the tables lined with lavish food. Guests arrived in expensive clothes, their faces unreadable. Some were there out of curiosity, others out of obligation. But beneath the polite smiles and murmured congratulations, judgment simmered. He could hear the whispers as he walked toward the altar. How much did she pay him? Poor boy, he must be miserable. He's just after her money. Disgusting. He kept his head down, his fists clenched at his sides. If only they knew the truth. If only they understood that this wasn't about greed, but survival. But they didn't care about his reasons. To them, he was a gold digger, a disgrace. As he stood next to his bride, his hands trembled. The old woman, in contrast, was composed. Her eyes held no emotion, only certainty. She had gotten what she wanted, and unlike him, she had no doubts. When the priest asked him if he took her as his wife, the words nearly got stuck in his throat. His lips felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds, but he forced them out, because there was no turning back now. "I do." No one noticed the single tear that slipped down his cheek. The wedding was over, the vows spoken, and the guests had left. Yet, as the boy stood inside the grand bedroom, staring at the unfamiliar luxury surrounding him, it felt as though his life had just begun to unravel. The air was thick with an uncomfortable silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His new wife sat on the edge of the bed, watching him with unreadable eyes. There was no nervousness in her expression, No hesitation, only expectation. She had gotten what she wanted, and now it was time for him to fulfill his role. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the buttons of his wedding attire, unsure of what to do or say. He had imagined many things about this night: fear, disgust, even shame, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer awkwardness of it. The idea of being with someone so much older, someone he had no feelings for, made his stomach churn. Yet he knew what was expected of him. He took a hesitant step forward, but his feet felt like they were made of stone. The closer he got to her, the more his heart pounded, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Sensing his hesitation, the old woman finally spoke. "You don't have to pretend," she said, her voice calm but firm. His eyes snapped to hers, confusion flickering across his face. She sighed, standing up and moving past him toward the window. "You think I married you for passion?" she asked, almost amused. "I married you because I was tired of being alone. That's all." He hadn't expected this. He had assumed that, like most marriages, there were certain duties he would have to fulfill, duties he had dreaded all evening. But her words stopped him in his tracks. "You can sleep wherever you want," she continued. "This house is big enough. Just remember why you're here. I gave you an escape from your suffering. In return, I expect loyalty, not love." The tension in the room shifted. He had been prepared for humiliation, for a night he would force himself through. But this was something else. For the first time since the wedding, he exhaled, the weight in his chest easing just a little. He didn't know if this arrangement made things better or worse, but one thing was certain: his marriage was not what he had feared. It was something entirely different, something he had yet to understand. Days passed, and the boy slowly adjusted to his new life. The mansion, once intimidating, began to feel less like a prison and more like an unfamiliar world he was forced to navigate. The old woman remained distant, but not unkind. She never demanded anything from him, never forced him to act like a loving husband. Instead, she treated him with a strange mix of authority and indifference, as if he were both her possession and her responsibility. One evening, as they sat in the grand dining hall, the silence between them grew heavier than usual. The boy had learned not to ask questions, but that night, she spoke first. "You must be wondering why I married you," she said, her voice steady. He looked up from his untouched plate, unsure how to respond. Of course, he had wondered. Every day, in fact. She exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping against the edge of her glass. "I never wanted love," she admitted. "I never even wanted marriage. But I needed something." The boy frowned. "What do you mean?" She looked at him then, her sharp eyes softening in a way he had never seen before. "I have no heir, no family. When I die, everything I built, my wealth, my home, will be left to strangers. I couldn't let that happen." The words settled over him like a weight. He had assumed she married him out of loneliness, or perhaps for companionship in her old age. But this was something else. "So you married me," he said slowly, piecing it together, "to make me your heir?" She gave a small nod. "I needed someone who would take care of what I leave behind. Someone who understands struggle. Someone who would not take my wealth for granted." Shock coursed through him. He had spent his life being invisible to the rich, discarded like he was nothing. And yet, here she was, telling him that she had chosen him, not as a husband, but as a successor. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or burdened. The idea of inheriting her wealth should have made him happy, but it only made him uneasy. He had never wanted riches. He had only wanted freedom from suffering. Still, something in her voice made him see her differently. She wasn't just an old woman clinging to wealth. She was someone who had built everything she had from nothing, someone who had fought battles he knew nothing about. In her own way, she had suffered too. For the first time, he saw her not as a stranger, not as a burden, but as a person with a past, one as lonely and painful as his own. And for the first time, he realized that this marriage was not just a prison for him. It was a transaction for her, a desperate attempt to make sure she would not be forgotten. In the days following their wedding night, something unexpected began to happen. The awkwardness between them did not disappear entirely, but it softened. The boy had expected to live in silent resentment, trapped in a marriage he had never wanted. But the old woman surprised him. She did not act like a demanding wife or a controlling master. Instead, she treated him with an odd sense of fairness. She never forced him to behave like a husband, nor did she demand affection. Instead, she made sure he was comfortable, that he ate well, that his siblings, whom she had allowed to stay in the mansion, were cared for. It was the first time in his life that he did not have to worry about survival. At first, he mistook her kindness for guilt, as if she were trying to compensate for making him marry her. But over time, he realized that this was simply who she was. Beneath her stern, composed exterior was a woman who understood pain, who had learned to protect herself by shutting the world out. One evening, he found her in the library, sitting by the fire with a book in her hands. She glanced at him, then gestured to the chair across from her. Without thinking, he sat down. "You don't talk much," she observed. He hesitated, then shrugged. "I never had much reason to." She chuckled, a low, knowing sound. "Neither did I." A comfortable silence settled between them, and for the first time, he did not feel like he was sitting across from a stranger. The more time he spent with her, the more he began to notice things he hadn't before. The way she carried herself with quiet dignity. The way she treated the servants with respect. The way her sharp gaze softened ever so slightly when she watched his younger siblings play in the garden. She was not the cold, calculating woman he had once thought her to be. Slowly, his resentment began to fade. In its place, something unfamiliar took root. Respect. He still did not love her, not in the way a young man should love his wife. But he no longer hated the life he had been forced into. She had given him something no one else had ever offered: security, dignity, a future. One day, as he passed her in the hallway, she paused and looked at him, as if studying him carefully. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice unreadable. He didn't know how to answer. Happiness was something he had never truly experienced, something he had never dared to hope for. But as he met her gaze, he realized that, for the first time in his life, he was no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough. The whispers never stopped. No matter how much time passed, society refused to accept their marriage. Every time the boy stepped outside the mansion, he felt their stares, some filled with curiosity, others with disgust. Look at him. He sold himself for wealth. He must be counting the days until she dies. She's a fool, thinking money can buy love. The words cut deep, even when he pretended not to care. He had never been respected when he was poor, but at least back then, he was invisible. Now, he was a spectacle. A young man married to an old woman, a story people told in whispers and laughter. His family, the same people who had once watched him suffer without offering help, were no different. Some distanced themselves entirely, embarrassed by his decision. Others suddenly treated him with forced kindness, hoping to benefit from his new life. "You live in a mansion now," an uncle had sneered once. "Don't forget where you came from." As if he could ever forget. His so-called friends were worse. The ones who had once shared his struggles now looked at him with suspicion or envy. Some accused him of betrayal, as if choosing survival over suffering was a crime. Others only came to him when they needed something, their words dripping with fake admiration. "You're lucky," they would say, their smiles insincere. "I wish an old rich woman would save me too." No one saw the nights he lay awake staring at the ceiling, questioning if he had done the right thing. No one understood the weight of his choices. And then there was the inner battle that raged within him. Should he stay? Should he leave? There were moments, fleeting but real, when he considered walking away. He had enough money now. He could start over somewhere else, build a life on his own terms. But every time he thought about leaving, he would see her. The old woman who had given him more than just wealth. She had given him respect, stability, a chance to be something more than just a poor boy struggling to survive. She had never forced him to love her, never tried to chain him with guilt or expectation. And yet, the thought of leaving her felt wrong. One evening, as they sat in the garden, he finally spoke the words that had been haunting him. "Do you regret marrying me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at the sky, as if searching for an answer in the stars. "No," she said at last. "Do you?" He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. Because for the first time, he didn't know what the answer was. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the old woman called the boy to her study. She sat behind her massive wooden desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression unreadable. "I have something for you," she said, sliding a sealed envelope across the desk. The boy hesitated before picking it up. The weight of the paper felt heavier than it should have. He looked at her, searching for an explanation, but she only gave him a knowing smile. "Open it." With careful fingers, he broke the seal and pulled out a set of documents. His eyes scanned the words, and his breath caught in his throat. The deed to the mansion, the transfer of ownership for her businesses, a bank account in his name. Everything she owned, everything she had built. It was all his. His head snapped up in shock. "What is this?" "My final gift to you," she said simply. "It's time." Confusion and disbelief swirled in his mind. "Why would you do this?" she sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Because I never needed a husband, boy. I needed someone I could trust, someone who would take care of everything when I'm gone." A lump formed in his throat. "Are you dying?" A small smile played on her lips. "Not today," she said lightly. "But I won't live forever, and I wanted to make sure you had a future before it was too late." His fingers tightened around the documents. A future, something he had never dared to dream of before meeting her. But was this a blessing or a mistake? For so long, he had thought of her as a stranger, a burden he was forced to carry. He had resented the marriage, hated the whispers, wished for freedom. But now, as he looked at the woman who had given him everything, he realized something that shook him to his core. She had saved him. Not just from poverty, but from himself, from a life of hopelessness, from a world that had never cared if he lived or died. And now, she was giving him the choice he had never had before, to stay or to walk away. His fingers trembled as he set the documents back on the desk. He took a deep breath and met her eyes. This time, not with fear, not with doubt, but with something new. Respect, gratitude, and maybe, just maybe, love. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. The old woman smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. "Good," she whispered. "Then it was all worth it." Years passed, and the boy, no longer a boy but a man, found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. What had once felt like a cruel twist of fate had instead become the turning point of his life. He had entered this marriage with tears of helplessness, convinced that he was sacrificing his future for survival. But in the end, he had gained more than he had ever imagined. The old woman had given him more than wealth. She had given him purpose. She had taught him strength, patience, and the value of wisdom. Where others had seen an unfair bargain, he had found a mentor, a protector, and, in a way, a kind of love he had never known before. Though their relationship had never been one of passion, it had been built on something deeper: mutual respect, trust, and an unspoken understanding. When she passed away, the house felt emptier than ever. The world whispered once more, spinning stories about the young man who inherited a fortune from the woman he had once been forced to marry. But this time, he didn't care. Because he knew the truth. She had not just given him her wealth, she had given him a future. And now, it was his responsibility to honor the life she had built. Standing before her grave, he whispered words he had never said to her in life. "Thank you." And as he walked away, he realized that, in the end, it had never been a curse. It had been the greatest blessing of his life.